The morning their luxury pool became a crime scene for wildlife officers. I bought my lakefront property for peace, not fights. The old fence behind my house wasn't fancy, but it had stood there longer than most of the homes around it. Then one morning, the HOA president decided it ruined everyone's view and promised it would come down. I warned her that fence protected far more than my backyard. She ignored every document, every warning, and every piece of evidence I handed her, until wildlife officers shut down the neighborhood pool and uncovered the mistake no one wanted to admit. Stick with me, because what happened next changed that HOA forever. And if you enjoy stories where ordinary people stand their ground with patience, solid evidence, and the law on their side, take a second to subscribe. There are plenty more true-to-life HOA battles and land rights stories coming up, and I'd be glad to have you here for the next one. The loudest sound that morning wasn't somebody yelling. It wasn't a chainsaw or a truck engine either. It was the sharp crack of old cedar as someone tested the strength of my fence from the other side. I stepped onto my back porch with a cup of coffee still in my hand and saw three strangers standing along my shoreline, pointing at posts my father and I had reinforced more than 20 years earlier. Behind them stood a woman in oversized sunglasses, perfectly pressed linen clothes, and a smile that looked practiced enough to survive any argument. That was the first time I met Rebecca Holloway. Looking back now, I should have recognized that smile for what it really was. It wasn't friendly. It was the smile of someone who had already decided she was going to win. My name is Nathan Mercer. I'm 57 years old, and before retirement I spent nearly 3 decades working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service restoring wetlands and protecting shoreline habitats across Montana. After my father passed away, I came home to the 38 acres he'd spent his entire life preserving. I wasn't interested in building luxury cabins or selling lakefront lots. I wanted peace. I wanted morning where the only thing interrupting my coffee was the cry of an osprey circling the water. The wooden fence running behind my property wasn't beautiful by magazine standards. The cedar boards had faded silver over the years, and a few posts leaned just enough to show their age. But every board had a purpose. It marked my property line. It protected my family's privacy. It kept my Labrador from wandering toward the marsh. Most importantly, it separated the maintained lawns of blue heron shores from the dense lakeside vegetation that belonged exactly where it was. I had never imagined anyone would look at that fence and see a problem. Rebecca climbed the gentle slope toward my porch before I had the chance to greet her. "Mr. Mercer?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew exactly who I was. "I am." She offered a hand that barely paused before dropping back to her side. "I'm Rebecca Holloway, president of Blue Heron Shores Homeowners Association." "I've heard the name." "I'm sure you have." She turned without asking permission and pointed toward the lake beyond my fence. "We've received several concerns from residents regarding this structure." I followed her finger. "My fence? It interrupts the community's lake view." I couldn't help smiling. "My community?" She ignored the question. "The homeowners behind your parcel purchased premium lake view properties. Unfortunately, your fence creates an unnecessary visual barrier." I looked from Rebecca to the fence, then back toward the water glittering beyond it. "The lake's still there." Her smile tightened. "You're missing the point." "No," I replied calmly. "I think I understand it perfectly." The 3 men she'd brought along walked the fence line slowly, measuring distances with their eyes. One tapped a post with his boot. I didn't like that. "This fence has been here longer than most of those houses," I said. "It was standing when I inherited the property, and county records show it was properly permitted years before your HOA expanded this subdivision." Rebecca folded her arms. "Neighborhood standards evolve. My deed doesn't." That answer hung between us longer than either of us expected. She stepped closer. "We're asking you to consider the good of the community." "I already do." She glanced toward the fence again. then removing it shouldn't be difficult. I shook my head. No. There wasn't any anger in my voice, just certainty. For a second, neither of us spoke. The only sound came from gentle waves brushing against the reeds beyond the fence. Rebecca finally broke the silence. You may not realize this yet, Mr. Mercer, but Blue Heron Shores takes property appearance very seriously. I take property ownership seriously. One of the men beside the fence quietly cleared his throat, sensing the conversation wasn't going the way Rebecca expected. She removed her sunglasses, revealing cold blue eyes that somehow felt less welcoming than the dark lenses had. I'd hate for this to become a compliance matter. I'd hate for someone to mistake my property for theirs. Neither of us smiled this time. Rebecca slid the sunglasses back into place and nodded once. I'll have our architectural committee review the situation. You're welcome to review whatever you like. And if they determine the fence violates community expectations, it doesn't. You seem very confident. I've read my deed. For the first time since she'd arrived, her expression cracked ever so slightly. Not frustration, calculation. She wasn't arguing facts anymore. She was measuring resistance. She turned toward her SUV, motioning for the others to follow. As they walked away, one of the men looked back over his shoulder at the fence, then at Rebecca, as if waiting for instructions that hadn't been spoken aloud. Rebecca opened her driver's door, but paused before getting inside. She looked directly at the fence one last time. Not at me. At the fence. The look lingered just long enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't the look of someone leaving after losing an argument. It was the look of someone already planning what would happen next. I stood there long after their vehicles disappeared down the gravel road. The lake had gone quiet again. The fence hadn't moved. But something else had. For the first time since inheriting my father's land, I had the unmistakable feeling that someone wasn't interested in asking permission anymore. They were already deciding what they intended to take. It started with envelopes. Every other day, another notice appeared in my mailbox carrying the Blue Heron Shores HOA logo. One questioned the appearance of my fence. Another requested an architectural review. A third announced a community visual assessment that somehow involved inspecting private shoreline improvements. None of the notices cited an actual section of the recorded covenants. They were heavy on opinions and light on authority. I read every page twice before filing it into a binder I'd labeled simply HOA. Years working for fish and wildlife had taught me one lesson that never failed. People lie. Paper usually doesn't. 3 days after Rebecca's visit, I drove into town and stopped by the county records office. I requested every recorded document tied to my parcel, including plats, easements, amendments, and historical surveys. The clerk recognized my family name almost immediately. "Mercer Place?" she asked. "That's right," she smiled. "Those records go back a long way. So does the fence." She disappeared into the archive room and returned, carrying a stack thick enough to fill half my passenger seat. That afternoon, I spread everything across my dining room table. Original survey, property deed, boundary certificates, historic shoreline maintenance agreements. Nothing mentioned a scenic corridor. Nothing mentioned a community view easement, because neither one existed. The following morning, I found something far more concerning than another violation letter. Fresh tire tracks crossed the damp grass beside my side gate. I hadn't driven there. Neither had any of my neighbors. Someone had. The latch on the gate hung open. I knew I'd closed it the evening before. Habit made me check it every night before bringing my dog inside. Now it swung freely in the breeze. I followed the tracks toward the fence. One cedar post leaned several inches farther than it had the day before. Not broken, tested. I crouched beside it and noticed fresh scrape marks where something metallic had pressed against the wood. I photographed everything before touching a single thing. Gate, tracks, fence, post, timestamp, date, location. Evidence first, questions later. That afternoon, another SUV rolled slowly past my property. Rebecca wasn't driving. Two men wearing polo shirts embroidered with the HOA logo stepped out carrying measuring wheels and clipboards. They didn't knock. They walked directly toward my fence. I met them halfway. "Can I help you?" One looked uncomfortable. "We're conducting measurements." "On whose property?" "The association requested." "This isn't association property." The second man glanced toward the lake. "We're evaluating future improvements." "You'll evaluate them from outside my fence." He looked back toward the road where Rebecca's white SUV sat parked beneath a cottonwood tree. She never got out. She simply watched. The two men quietly packed their measuring wheel and left without another word. Rebecca remained in the driver's seat until they climbed inside. As she pulled away, she lowered her window just enough to call out. "This would all be much easier if you cooperated," I answered without raising my voice. "It usually is when people stay on their own property." She drove off. That evening, I received another phone call. "Nathan?" The voice sounded familiar. "Tom Ellis." I smiled despite myself. Tom had retired from the county survey office years ago. He'd known my father even longer. "You got a minute?" "For you, always," he laughed. "I heard Blue Heron's measuring your fence." News travels. In this county, faster than the mail, Tom arrived an hour later carrying a weathered tube filled with rolled survey maps. We spread them across my kitchen table. He pointed to the original subdivision drawing recorded decades before the HOA even existed. "See this line?" I nodded. "That's your fence." "Exactly. It matches the survey." Tom smiled. "Not just the survey." He tapped another page. "This shoreline management plan was filed with the county before those lake houses were ever built." I looked closer. The fence alignment had been drawn in ink, deliberately, officially. "It wasn't there for decoration," Tom said quietly. "What was it for?" He leaned back in his chair. "Your father worked with state conservation folks. They wanted a managed buffer between the marsh and future development. A wildlife corridor." He nodded. "And a barrier." I stared at the old documents. Rebecca thought she was fighting an ugly fence. She had no idea she was challenging part of the original shoreline protection plan itself. As Tom rolled the maps back into their tube, he looked toward the window overlooking the lake. "If they're trying this hard to erase that fence," he said, "I'd start asking myself why." I looked toward the quiet shoreline where reeds moved gently along the water's edge. For the first time, I wasn't wondering whether the fence was in danger. I was wondering what someone hoped to gain if it disappeared. Tom's maps stayed spread across my dining room table for most of the evening. The more I studied the original shoreline management plan, the more one detail stood out. The fence wasn't simply drawn along my property line. It marked the beginning of a designated buffer separating maintained residential lawns from the marsh vegetation that bordered the lake. Years ago, people understood something Rebecca apparently didn't. Shorelines weren't just scenery. They were living systems. The next morning, I decided to walk the entire fence line before sunrise. It didn't take long to find another surprise. Along the damp ground outside the fence, a narrow trail cut through the waist-high grass. The reeds were bent in one direction, forming a path that hadn't existed a week earlier. I crouched beside it and immediately recognized what I was looking at. Not human footprints, wildlife movement. The disturbed vegetation continued toward the narrow strip separating my property from the HOA pool complex. The route wasn't obvious unless you knew what to look for, but I'd spent most of my career reading signs exactly like these. Something had begun using the opening created around the damaged gate. I followed the trail only as far as my property boundary before stopping to photograph every section. Fresh tracks, flattened grass, broken reeds, the loosened fence post. Each image went into the same folder as every violation letter Rebecca had mailed me. By lunchtime, I had drafted a formal letter addressed to the entire HOA board. I kept emotion out of it. Recent disturbances to the shoreline buffer have altered an established wildlife corridor. Continued unauthorized entry or modification of the fence line may increase animal movement toward residential common areas, including the community pool. I attached photographs. I included dates. I referenced the original shoreline plan Tom had shown me. Then I sent copies by certified mail and email. Late that afternoon, my phone rang. "Nathan?" The voice was unfamiliar. "This is Brian Foster." I recognized the name immediately. Blue Heron Shores maintenance supervisor. "I hope you don't mind me calling. What can I do for you?" There was a long pause. "I probably shouldn't be talking to you. But you're right." I stayed quiet. "The snakes. What about them? We've been getting reports all spring. From residents? Maintenance crews." My grip tightened around the phone. "How many?" "I don't know exactly. But more than one?" "A lot more." Brian lowered his voice. "They've mostly been spotted near the shoreline behind your property." "Did Rebecca know?" Another pause. "I filed maintenance reports, and they disappeared." I leaned back in my chair. "Disappeared?" "They never made it into the board meeting packets." I didn't say anything. Brian continued. "Last month, one of our landscaping crews refused to trim the marsh edge because they found fresh snake skins under the brush." "Was that documented?" "Yes." "And Rebecca?" "She said we weren't going to alarm homeowners over normal wildlife." Normal wildlife. The phrase echoed in my mind. There was nothing unusual about snakes living near a Montana lakeshore. What was unusual was opening the exact corridor designed to keep them away from crowded recreation areas. Brian spoke again. "There's something else. I'm listening. Rebecca keeps talking about improving the lake view." "I know. She met with people from a resort development company 2 weeks ago." That caught my attention. "What kind of meeting?" "I wasn't invited. But you saw them. They toured the clubhouse and the shoreline twice." After we ended the call, I drove to the western edge of my property where the fence curved toward the marsh. The late afternoon light made every disturbance stand out. Someone had trimmed sections of brush outside my boundary. Not enough to attract attention. Just enough to widen the natural opening leading toward the HOA walking trail. I photographed everything. Fresh cuts, discarded branches, vehicle tracks. Every piece fit a little better than the last. Rebecca wasn't trying to improve anyone's view. She was trying to create an uninterrupted sightline from the clubhouse to the lake. The fence wasn't the real obstacle. The protected shoreline buffer was. As I turned back toward the house, movement caught the corner of my eye. A dark shape slipped silently through the reeds beyond the damaged section of fence before disappearing into the tall grass. I couldn't identify the species from that distance. I didn't need to. The corridor was already being used. And if I could see it, it wouldn't be long before someone else did too. The hearing notice arrived 2 days later. Rebecca had scheduled it for the following Tuesday evening in the Blue Heron Shores clubhouse, calling it a formal compliance review regarding my non-conforming shoreline improvement. It sounded official enough to intimidate someone who hadn't read the governing documents. I had. Instead of feeling nervous, I spent the next 48 hours organizing evidence. One binder held every violation letter the HOA had sent me. Another contained certified surveys, county plats, and the original deed. A third held photographs of the disturbed fence line, tire tracks, the opened gate, trimmed vegetation, and the wildlife corridor. By the time I finished, my dining room table looked less like a home office and more like an evidence room. I made one more phone call before leaving. Rachel Bennett answered on the second ring. "I've reviewed everything you emailed." "And?" "They're making claims they can't support." "I thought so." "You don't need to outshout them, Nathan." "I wasn't planning to." "Good," she paused. "Just let the documents speak." When I walked into the clubhouse that evening, Rebecca greeted residents as though the outcome had already been decided. She stood near the front with a polished smile, shaking hands and thanking people for attending. Several board members nodded politely when I entered. Rebecca didn't. She simply glanced at the 3 binders I carried. That's quite a lot of paperwork. It usually takes that much to answer unsupported accusations. A few homeowners looked at each other. The meeting began promptly. Rebecca opened with a slideshow displaying photographs of my fence. Blue Heron Shores has always valued open lake views, she announced. This aging structure negatively impacts the community experience. She clicked to another photograph. Our goal is cooperation. Rachel quietly leaned toward me. Notice she hasn't cited a single covenant. I nodded. Rebecca continued. The board believes removal represents the most reasonable solution. When she finally finished, the floor was opened for my response. I stood without raising my voice. I'd like the board clerk to read Section 14 of the recorded boundary provisions attached to Lot 7. The clerk looked confused. Rebecca frowned. We're discussing architectural standards. I understand. But I'd still appreciate hearing the recorded language. The board attorney glanced toward the clerk. Go ahead. She opened a thick binder and searched through several pages before reading aloud. Existing recorded boundary improvements acknowledged by prior recorded approvals shall remain the responsibility of the property owner unless voluntarily altered by said owner. The room grew noticeably quieter. I slid a document across the table. This is the recorded approval referenced in that provision. The attorney picked it up first. His eyebrows lifted slightly. It predates the current association, he said, by almost 20 years. Rebecca folded her arms. That doesn't change modern appearance standards. Rachel stood. It changes everything. She calmly handed the attorney copies of the county survey, deed, and approval letter. The HOA may regulate certain aesthetic features where authorized by its governing documents. She tapped the approval letter. It cannot revoke recorded property rights simply because a later board prefers a different view. Nobody interrupted her. She continued. This fence isn't an unauthorized improvement. It's a documented boundary feature acknowledged by both the county and the association's predecessor. Rebecca shifted in her chair. Dale, another board member, finally spoke. We weren't aware of this document. Tom Ellis, sitting quietly near his back, stood up. I was. Every head turned toward him. I surveyed this shoreline before most of these homes were built. He walked to the front carrying the same rolled maps he'd shown me days earlier. The fence wasn't placed randomly. He spread the original shoreline plan across the table. It formed part of the approved shoreline buffer protecting the marsh transition. Several homeowners leaned forward. One asked quietly, Buffer from what? Tom answered without hesitation. Wildlife movement. A murmur spread through the room. Rebecca quickly tried to regain control. This meeting concerns property appearance. No, I replied. It concerns property authority. I opened my final binder. Inside were photographs of the disturbed gate, trimmed vegetation, and documented wildlife trails. I also submitted written warnings explaining why disturbing this buffer creates unnecessary risk. The attorney looked toward Rebecca. Did the board receive these? She hesitated. They were reviewed. Rachel slid certified mail receipts across the table. They were delivered. The attorney said nothing for several seconds. Then he asked Rebecca the question that changed the room. Did anyone verify legal authority before issuing this violation? Silence. Rebecca looked toward Dale. Dale looked down at the table. No one answered. The attorney slowly removed his glasses. I'd like a brief executive session. The board disappeared into a side conference room. No one spoke while they were gone. For nearly 10 minutes, the clubhouse remained almost completely silent, except for the quiet turning of pages as homeowners began reading copies of the documents Rachel had distributed. When the board finally returned, Rebecca's confident smile was gone. The attorney spoke instead. After reviewing the recorded documents and prior approvals, the board is withdrawing the violation notice. A ripple of whispers spread across the room. The association will pursue no further enforcement regarding Mr. Mercer's fence. Rebecca opened her mouth to object. The attorney interrupted before she could. And no contractor or representative of the HOA is authorized to enter Mr. Mercer's property without his written permission. I closed my binders. The legal battle was over. But as Rebecca stared toward the windows overlooking the lake, I had the uneasy feeling she still believed she could win another way. Most people think winning a dispute feels exciting. It doesn't. Not when you've spent weeks documenting every conversation, every photograph, every violation notice, only to prove something you already knew was true. The morning after the hearing, I walked the fence line carrying nothing more than a hammer, a handful of galvanized nails, and a replacement cedar board for one of the loosened sections. The fence looked exactly the way it had before Rebecca ever appeared. Except now I couldn't look at it without seeing fingerprints. Not literal ones. Evidence. Every disturbed post reminded me someone had already crossed a line they weren't supposed to cross. I replaced the damaged board, reset the leaning post with fresh gravel, and checked the gate latch twice before heading back toward the house. Something still bothered me. The legal issue had been settled. The land itself hadn't. Instead of returning indoors, I walked beyond the fence to the edge of the marsh, staying inside my property line. The trimmed vegetation I'd photographed earlier hadn't grown back. Someone had removed far more than I first realized. The opening through the cattails stretched nearly 20 feet wider than it should have. That wasn't accidental maintenance. It had been deliberate. I photographed the area again from several different angles before comparing the images with older photographs stored on my phone. The difference was obvious. Weeks earlier, dense vegetation forced anything moving through the marsh to remain well south of the neighborhood walking trail. Now there was a clear opening leading almost directly toward the paved path behind the clubhouse. I didn't like what I was seeing. That afternoon, Brian Foster pulled into my driveway in an aging maintenance pickup. He looked over both shoulders before climbing out. "I can't stay long." "You don't have to." He handed me a plain manila envelope. "I figured you should have these before they disappear too." Inside were photocopies of maintenance work orders. Each one carried the same HOA logo. Each one documented wildlife activity near the shoreline. Snake sighting near drainage culvert, deferred. Additional wildlife observed near Pool Service Road. No action. Recommend preserving existing vegetation barrier, denied. I flipped to the last page. Work order 2147, requested by Brian Foster. Subject: do not remove shoreline vegetation adjacent to Mercer property without environmental review. Status: rejected. Approval signature: Rebecca Holloway. I looked up. She signed this herself? Brian nodded. She said the shoreline needed to look cleaner before potential investors toured the property. Investors. So that's what this has really been about. Brian sighed. I never heard the whole conversation. But I heard enough. They weren't talking about homeowners. They were talking about future buyers. That fit every piece I'd collected. The open lake view, the unnecessary inspections, the pressure to remove the fence. Someone wanted the shoreline to look like uninterrupted resort property. My fence, and the protected vegetation surrounding it, stood in the middle of that sales pitch. Brian lowered his voice. There's one more thing. I waited. The landscaping crew was back yesterday. Where? Near the pool. What were they doing? Cutting brush. I felt my stomach tighten. Did anyone authorize environmental review? Brian shook his head. They were told to make the shoreline more visible. I thanked him, scanned every work order into my computer, and locked the originals inside my office safe. If anyone questioned Brian later, I wanted the documents preserved exactly as I received them. The next morning, I sent another certified letter. This one went not only to the HOA board, but also to the association's attorney. I attached copies of Brian's work orders, updated photographs of the altered vegetation, and another written warning. I kept the language professional. The continued removal of shoreline vegetation following withdrawal of the enforcement action increases the likelihood of wildlife movement into developed common areas. I strongly recommend suspending further alterations pending ecological review. By late afternoon, I received a single email response. Not from Rebecca, from the board attorney. Your correspondence has been received and added to the association file. Nothing more. No disagreement. No denial. Just confirmation that someone besides me now knew exactly what had been happening. That evening, I carried my coffee onto the back porch and watched the quiet shoreline as the sun settled behind the western ridge. The fence stood where it always had, solid, unmoving. For the first time in weeks, nobody measured it. Nobody photographed it. Nobody argued about it. Yet something felt different. Near the widened opening beyond the marsh, a flock of ducks suddenly burst into the air all at once. A second later, the tall grass moved, not from wind, from something passing through it. Slowly, purposefully, heading in the direction of the neighborhood. The legal fight had ended. I wasn't nearly as certain the real consequences had. 3 days later, the first Saturday of summer arrived. By 9 that morning, the Blue Heron Shores pool was crowded. I could hear children shouting from my back porch, followed by the sharp whistle of a lifeguard and the scrape of deck chairs across concrete. The sound carried easily over the open section of shoreline Rebecca's crews had cleared. Then came the scream. It cut through everything. A second later, another voice shouted, "Get out of the water!" I was already moving before I reached the fence. People were climbing from the pool in every direction. Parents grabbed children under the arms and pulled them onto the deck. A woman near the shallow end stumbled backward into a row of chairs, sending 2 of them skidding across the concrete. Near the drain line, a thick, dark snake moved through the water. It wasn't attacking anyone. It didn't have to. Panic did the rest. The lifeguard blew his whistle until his face turned red, but nobody was listening. Children cried. Adults shouted over one another. Someone called emergency services while another person began filming with a phone. Rebecca appeared from the clubhouse wearing white slacks and the same oversized sunglasses she'd worn the first day she came to my property. "Everyone remain calm," she shouted. Nobody did. I reached the outside of the pool fence and stopped there. I wasn't about to enter HOA property during an emergency unless someone with authority asked me to. Rebecca saw me immediately. Her face hardened. "What are you doing here?" I heard the screaming. "This doesn't concern you." Before I could answer, the snake reached the edge of the pool and disappeared beneath a storage bench near the maintenance gate. The crowd surged away from it. Brian came running from the pump house carrying a long-handled barrier hook used for moving debris, not animals. He stopped several feet away and looked toward me. "Nathan?" "Don't corner it," I said. "Clear the area and wait for wildlife officers." Rebecca spun toward him. "Remove it now." Brian didn't move. "That's not safe. It is a snake, Brian, not a bear, and I am not trained to handle it." That answer silenced her for half a second. Sirens approached from the main road. A county deputy arrived first, followed by an ambulance and a Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks truck. The officer who stepped out of the wildlife vehicle was Olivia Carter. I knew her by reputation, though we'd only met once at a wetland restoration conference years earlier. She took control quickly. "Everybody behind the clubhouse line. Nobody enters the pool enclosure." Rebecca stepped forward. "I'm Rebecca Holloway, HOA president. This is clearly an isolated wildlife event." Olivia looked at the empty pool deck. the open maintenance gate, and the disturbed vegetation beyond it. We'll determine that. The snake was removed without injury and secured for relocation. No one had been bitten, but 2 children were checked by paramedics after falling during the evacuation. Rebecca seemed relieved by that. Then Olivia walked past the pool instead of returning to her truck. She crouched near the service gate and examined the damp soil. Her eyes followed a faint track through the cut vegetation toward my fence line. "Who cleared this corridor?" she asked. Rebecca answered too quickly. "Routine maintenance." Olivia stood. Routine maintenance doesn't usually cut directly through a shoreline buffer. Several residents turned toward Rebecca. I stayed silent. Olivia followed the route farther, stopping at the damaged post and widened opening I'd photographed days earlier. She knelt again, studying the flattened grass. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Mercer, did you report this?" "Twice in writing." Rebecca stepped between us. "He has been exaggerating this situation for weeks because of a fence dispute." Olivia's expression didn't change. "Do you have copies of those warnings?" "Yes." "Bring them." Rebecca removed her sunglasses. "Officer, shutting down the pool over one snake is excessive." Olivia looked directly at her. "I'm not shutting it down over one snake." She pointed toward the trail leading through the disturbed shoreline. "I'm shutting it down because I don't yet know how many animals are using this route, why the buffer was altered, or whether the HOA ignored a documented safety risk." The pool gates were chained before noon. A bright red closure notice went up where the summer schedule had been posted that morning. Rebecca stood beneath it, surrounded by angry parents and silent board members, while Olivia photographed every section of cleared vegetation. For weeks, Rebecca had treated my warnings like an inconvenience. Now the same warnings were about to become evidence. Olivia Carter returned the next morning with 2 wildlife technicians, measuring flags, cameras, and a stack of inspection forms. The pool remained locked behind a chain, its blue water perfectly still beneath the red closure notice. Rebecca was already waiting. She had brought the HOA attorney and 3 board members, as if numbers could turn an investigation into a meeting she controlled. Olivia didn't give her that chance. "I need access to the shoreline maintenance records, landscaping invoices, wildlife complaints, and every work order involving this corridor for the last 12 months. Rebecca folded her arms. "Some of those records are internal." "Not anymore." The attorney quietly told her to cooperate. I met Olivia at my fence with copies of the 2 certified warnings, the photographs I'd taken before and after the vegetation was cut, and Tom's shoreline plan. She laid the images across the hood of her truck. "This was taken when?" I pointed to the timestamp. 9 days before the pool incident. "And this one?" "The evening before." The difference was hard to argue with. Dense reeds in the first photograph, a widened channel in the second, freshly cut brush leading toward the pool service road. Olivia followed the route on foot. She marked flattened grass, drag lines in damp soil, and 2 shed skins caught beneath low branches. At the damaged fence post, she stopped and photographed the metal scrape marks. "Was this post struck by equipment?" "I can't prove what caused it." "But it appeared after the HOA inspection?" "Yes." Rebecca heard that and stepped forward. "Mr. Mercer has been building a narrative against this board since we asked him to cooperate." Olivia looked up from the post. "Olga, he photographed the damage before the snake entered your pool." Rebecca had no answer. The investigation moved toward the maintenance building. Brian Foster stood beside the door holding a cardboard file box. His face looked pale, but his hands were steady. "I need to speak with you privately," he told Olivia. Rebecca crossed the pavement before Olivia could respond. "Brian, you are an HOA employee. Any records you possess belong to the association." Brian looked at her for a long moment. "These are copies of safety reports I submitted." They were addressed internally. They were ignored internally. The silence that followed felt heavier than any shouting could have. Olivia took the box. Inside were dated reports of snake activity near the drainage culvert, recommendations to preserve the vegetation barrier, photographs from maintenance crews, and emails directing staff not to discuss sightings with residents. One message carried Rebecca's name at the bottom. Delay distribution until after the resort presentation. We do not need unnecessary concern affecting the shoreline improvement plan. Olivia read it twice. What resort presentation? She asked. Rebecca turned toward the attorney. He didn't help her. Brian handed over another document. It was a landscaping order authorizing brush removal from the clubhouse sightline to the lake. The work description specifically included the area beside my fence. Approval signature, Rebecca Holloway. The same corridor she had called an accident was now tied directly to her instructions. Olivia closed the file box. This is no longer a routine wildlife response. Rebecca's voice sharpened. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. Olivia pointed toward the locked pool. I'm documenting that the HOA received repeated wildlife warnings, removed part of an established shoreline barrier, and delayed informing residents while preparing a commercial presentation. The board attorney asked the question Rebecca didn't want answered. Could that be considered negligence? Olivia looked at the altered shoreline. That determination won't be mine alone. She issued a written preservation order covering the pool perimeter, maintenance records, landscaping contracts, emails, and surveillance footage. No vegetation could be removed. No damaged fence section could be altered. Nothing could be discarded until the investigation ended. By noon, the entire route from the marsh to the pool was marked with small orange flags. Each one showed another place where the land had been disturbed. Rebecca stood at the edge of the pavement, watching officers photograph her decisions one piece at a time. She had spent weeks trying to erase a boundary. Instead, she had created a trail anyone could follow, and that trail led straight back to her. By Monday evening, the Blue Heron Shores clubhouse was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Not because the HOA had organized another meeting about landscaping or architectural standards. People wanted answers. The swimming pool was still closed. Yellow caution tape stretched across the entrance, and every family driving past it saw the same notice from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, announcing an active investigation. Summer had barely started. Parents were furious. Rebecca sat at the center of the board table, trying to look composed, but the confidence she'd worn during our hearing was gone. She kept rearranging papers that no one seemed interested in reading. The room quieted when the board attorney stood. Tonight's meeting will address questions regarding the temporary pool closure and the ongoing investigation. A hand shot up immediately. It belonged to a father whose two young daughters had been at the pool when the snake appeared. My kids were in that water, he said. I want to know why nobody warned us there had already been wildlife reports. Rebecca answered before anyone else could. There was no indication this incident would occur. Brian Foster stood from the back row. There was. Every head turned. Rebecca's expression hardened. Brian, this isn't the time. It is exactly the time. He walked to the front carrying the same copies he'd given Olivia. I filed 7 maintenance reports this spring. He laid them across the table. I recommended preserving the shoreline vegetation. Another document followed. I recommended suspending additional clearing. Another. I reported snake activity near the drainage corridor. The room grew silent. One homeowner leaned forward. And what happened? Brian looked directly at Rebecca. My reports were rejected. Rebecca shook her head. They were incomplete. Brian calmly slid forward the signed work orders. They were complete enough for you to deny. A low murmur spread through the audience. Then an older woman raised her hand. I've lived here 14 years. Everyone turned toward her. I remember that fence. She pointed toward me. It was already there when my husband and I bought our house. Tom Ellis nodded from across the room. It was supposed to be. The board attorney looked toward him. You can verify that? I surveyed the subdivision. Tom placed the original shoreline map on the projector table. The fence marks the transition between maintained residential property and protected shoreline habitat. He tapped another line. And this vegetation wasn't decorative. It slowed wildlife movement toward developed areas. Several homeowners exchanged uneasy looks. One man quietly asked, "So, we cut down the thing that was protecting us?" Nobody answered immediately, because nobody's could. Rebecca finally leaned into the microphone. The board acted in good faith, Rachel Bennett stood. Good faith requires informed decisions. She handed copies of the certified warning letters to the attorney. My client notified the board twice. She held up the delivery confirmations. The HOA accepted both. Another homeowner stood. Wait, he looked directly at Rebecca. So Nathan warned you before the pool incident? Rebecca hesitated. We received correspondence. Did you tell residents? No. The room erupted. Questions came from every direction. Why wasn't the pool inspected? Who approved the brush removal? Why were maintenance reports ignored? Were you trying to hide something? The attorney repeatedly asked for order, but the frustration had been building for weeks. It wasn't only about the snake anymore. It was about trust. When the meeting finally settled, Sheriff Daniel Brooks walked in wearing his uniform and carrying a slim evidence folder. I'll keep this brief. The room became silent again. My office has opened an investigation into reported unauthorized entry onto Mr. Mercer's property. Rebecca looked up sharply. Sheriff Brooks continued. We've received photographs, witness statements, and documentation indicating individuals acting on behalf of the HOA entered private property after being denied permission. He looked toward the board. If anyone has information regarding those entries, I'd encourage you to speak with my office before we begin formal interviews. The warning landed exactly the way he intended. No threats, no accusations, just facts. Rebecca tried one last defense. We were simply protecting community interests, Sheriff Brooks answered calmly. Property ownership is also a community interest. No one applauded. No one needed to. The silence that followed carried more weight than applause ever could. As residents slowly filed out of the clubhouse, they weren't looking at my fence anymore. They were looking at Rebecca. For the first time since this began, she wasn't the person asking questions. She was the one expected to answer them, and judging by the expressions around the room. Her hardest meeting was still ahead. 3 days later, every member of the Blue Heron Shores board received the same packet. Rachel Bennett had prepared it with the precision of someone who understood that facts don't need dramatic language. Inside were the certified warning letters I'd sent before the pool incident, the original shoreline surveys, the recorded deed approval protecting my fence, Brian Foster's maintenance reports, Tom Ellis's historical boundary maps, Olivia Carter's preliminary environmental findings, and photographs documenting every stage of the shoreline alteration. No opinions, no accusations, just evidence arranged in chronological order. The board's special executive meeting began at 6 that evening. Unlike the previous gathering, homeowners weren't there to ask questions. They were there to watch answers become unavoidable. Rebecca arrived carrying a thick folder of her own. She still looked determined. But determination isn't the same thing as leverage. The board attorney opened the meeting. We have received the preliminary findings from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. He paused before looking toward Olivia, who had been invited to summarize the investigation. The shoreline buffer adjacent to Mr. Mercer's property served a documented ecological purpose, Olivia said. Field observations indicate vegetation removal and repeated disturbance created a more direct movement corridor between wetland habitat and developed recreational facilities. She projected side-by-side photographs onto the screen. Before, after. No one in the room needed an explanation. The difference spoke for itself. Rebecca cleared her throat. There is still no proof that our maintenance caused the snake to enter the pool. Olivia answered carefully. My report doesn't claim certainty. She clicked to the next slide. It documents that the risk increased after repeated alteration of an established shoreline barrier despite multiple written warnings. That wording mattered. Everyone in the room understood why. Rachel stood next. I'd like the board to review one additional timeline. She handed each member a copy. Across 4 pages, every event appeared in order. Rebecca demanded the fence be removed. Unauthorized inspections followed. Fence posts were disturbed. Vegetation was cleared. Nathan submitted written warnings. Maintenance reports were rejected. The violation against Nathan was withdrawn. The pool incident occurred. No gaps, no speculation. Only dates supported by documents. The board attorney slowly turned the final page. Then he looked toward Rebecca. Did you authorize the shoreline clearing shown in these work orders? She hesitated. It was routine maintenance. He slid Brian's signed work orders beside Olivia's report. The maintenance descriptions specifically reference improving the clubhouse view. Rebecca said nothing. Another board member quietly asked, were we informed about the wildlife recommendations before approving that work? No, Rachel answered. The recommendations were rejected administratively before they ever reached the full board. Several heads turned toward Rebecca. One by one, the silence became uncomfortable. Then the association's insurance representative, attending by video conference, appeared on the large screen. I've completed an initial liability review. Every board member straightened. He continued in a measured voice. If the documentation provided is accurate, the association may have exposure arising from unauthorized property enforcement, disregard of documented safety concerns, and actions exceeding recorded HOA authority. He wasn't finished. Our carrier expects immediate corrective action. What kind of action? One board member asked. A change in governance. Nobody misunderstood what he meant. Rebecca finally spoke. I acted to improve this community. An older board member shook his head. No. He looked around the table. You acted without bringing us the whole truth. Another member added quietly, we voted based on incomplete information. For the first time since this entire conflict began, Rebecca had no prepared response. The attorney placed one final document in front of the board. A motion has been submitted. He read it aloud. Motion to remove Rebecca Holloway as president of Blue Heron Shores Homeowners Association, effective immediately, and adopt revised procedures requiring legal review, environmental review, and written property owner consent before any future enforcement involving recorded boundary improvements. One by one, the votes were cast. Not quickly, not emotionally, deliberately. When the final vote was counted, the result wasn't close. The motion passed. Rebecca remained seated for several seconds after everyone else stood. She slowly gathered the same folder she'd carried into every confrontation with me. It suddenly looked much smaller than it had before. As she reached the door, she stopped beside my chair. For a moment, I thought she might argue one last time. Instead, she quietly asked, "You knew this fence would become bigger than a fence, didn't you?" I looked toward the lake visible through the clubhouse windows. No. I met her eyes. I just knew the truth has a way of reaching people, if you leave it enough room. She walked out without another word. The documents she had ignored had done what no argument ever could. They hadn't just protected my property. They had ended her authority. The pool remained closed for another 3 weeks. During that time, Olivia Carter supervised a full review of the shoreline between the clubhouse and my property. The HOA replaced the vegetation it had removed, installed low wildlife barriers near the pool service road, repaired the drainage corridor, and adopted a maintenance plan that required environmental approval before anyone touched the marsh again. The repairs cost money, not enough to destroy the association, but enough that every homeowner understood what Rebecca's obsession with appearances had created. The new board sent me a formal letter acknowledging that my fence was a lawful recorded boundary improvement and part of the original shoreline management plan. They also confirmed that no HOA employee, contractor, or board member could enter my property without written permission. Rachel read the letter once and set it on my kitchen table. "Keep the original." "I keep everything," she smiled. "I know." Sheriff Daniel Brooks completed his investigation a week later. The evidence did not support criminal charges against every person who had crossed my boundary, but the HOA signed a written trespass settlement and reimbursed me for the damaged posts, survey costs, and attorney's fees. The contractors received formal notices that future unauthorized entry would be prosecuted. It wasn't a dramatic courtroom ending. There was no judge pounding a gavel while Rebecca stood in defeat. The result was quieter than that, and more permanent. Every agreement was signed. Every boundary was recorded. Every warning Rebecca had ignored was now part of the association's official file. Brian Foster kept his job. The new board promoted him to facilities director and gave him direct authority to suspend work whenever safety reports were ignored. He told me he almost resigned before handing Olivia that box of documents. "I'm glad you didn't," I said. "So am I." Tom Ellis returned one afternoon carrying a new copy of the shoreline map. He had marked the restored buffer in green pencil and drawn a small circle around my fence. "Looks like your father knew what he was doing." "He usually did." Tom studied the cedar posts for a moment. "Funny how people call something useless until they need it." That sentence stayed with me. The pool reopened on a clear Saturday morning. There were new warning signs near the trail, fresh plantings along the marsh, and a locked maintenance gate where the open corridor had been. Olivia inspected the work before removing the closure notice herself. Families returned slowly. Parents watched the shoreline more carefully than they had before. Children still laughed and splashed, but the adults finally understood that the lake wasn't a painted backdrop behind their homes. It was habitat. It had rules older than any HOA. I watched from my side of the fence. No one complained about the view. Rebecca never came back to my property. I heard she resigned from the board entirely and ended her talks with the resort developer after the association refused to support the expansion proposal. I didn't celebrate. By then, I understood that humiliation had never been the point. My wife used to tell me that peace wasn't the absence of conflict. It was knowing what you would protect when conflict arrived. After she died, I came back to my father's land because I needed something solid beneath me. The fence, the lake, and the old cedar posts were pieces of that life. Rebecca saw obstacles. I saw responsibilities. One evening, I carried my coffee onto the porch and watched the last light settle across the water. The repaired fence cast a long shadow over the grass. Beyond it, the reeds moved naturally again, guiding wildlife away from the homes and back along the lake. Nothing looked dramatic. That was the beauty of it. The property line remained where it had always been. The pool was safe. The community had learned that authority without evidence was only noise. And I had what I wanted from the beginning. Not revenge, not applause, peace. The strongest fences are not built from wood. They are built from truth, law, and the courage to defend both.
If this story taught me anything, it's that the things we protect often serve a purpose long before we fully understand it. The old fence wasn't just making a property line, it protected a shoreline, respected the way nature moved, and reminded everyone that good decisions are usually built on facts, not assumptions. Steadying your brow doesn't always mean raising your voice. Sometimes it means keeping careful records, staying patient, and trusting that the truth will eventually speak louder than opinions. I think that's something worth remembering. Whether you're dealing with an HOA, a neighbor, or any challenge in life, Real strength isn't about getting even, it's about protecting what's right, treating people fairly, and refusing to give up simply because someone else has more confidence than evidence. In the end, peace feels a lot better than proving someone wrong. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had someone questions your property, your right, or something you work hard to protect? If your would house stood your ground the way Nathan did, type yes in the comments. And if you ever deal with an HOA that forgot where its authority and broke a work justice, I read as many of stories as I can, and they often inspire future videos. If you enjoy stories about ordinary people standing firm with dignity, patience, and the law on their side, I'd be honored if you subscribe and join us for the next one. There's always another story worth telling.